Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back, away from the grand ballrooms and the glittering gaslight of Victorian high society. We're going to a place where the light is a little dimmer, the air a little thicker with dust. We're leaving behind the rustle of silk and the murmur of polite conversation, and listening instead for the softer, more persistent sound, the whisper of a needle through cloth, the sigh of a weary breath in a cold room. Tonight, we aren't following the queens and the courtesans. We're following the thread. We're meeting the hands that held it. We're asking a simple, sleepy question. In an age of extravagant fashion, who truly wore the dresses? And what ghosts did they carry with them? So, settle in. Dim the lights and let your mind wander into the shadows cast by all that grandeur. The year is, let's say, 1851. The Great Exhibition is opening in London, a vast cathedral of glass and iron built to showcase the triumphs of the British Empire. It's a festival of industry, of progress, of raw materials and finished wonders. And in the West End, the ladies of society are preparing their own exhibitions. They need gowns. Not just any gowns, but confections of silk and tulle, bodices tight as a vice, skirts wide enough to require their own postal code. They are dresses as statements of power, of wealth, of social position. They are, to all appearances, magnificent. And in a small, airless attic room in Spitalfields, a young woman, let's call her Eleanor, is making one of them. Her world is defined by this dress. The light from the single, grimy window is fading, but she works on, her back aching from hunching over, her fingers sore and pricked from the countless hours of labor. She is a slop worker, part of a vast, invisible army of needlewomen who turned the whims of the rich into tangible reality. She will never wear this dress. She likely couldn't even afford the thread she's using. But for a few weeks, this gown is her entire existence. She knows the woman she is making it for. She's seen her name on the order, Lady Arabella Harcourt. The name itself sounds like money. Eleanor imagines her, sometimes tall, probably, with an air of bored indifference. She imagines her at the ball, under 1,000 crystal lights, spinning in this very dress. She tries to pour care into her work, because her pittance of a wage depends on it being perfect. But it's hard to be careful when your vision is blurring from fatigue, when your stomach is gnawing with hunger, when the chill of the room seems to have seeped into your very bones. And as she works, other things seep into the dress. A drop of blood from a pricked finger, quickly blotted away, but leaving a tiny, invisible stain. The salt from a tear of frustration, shed when she had to unpick an entire sleeve because her tired eyes misread the pattern. The scent of soot from the London air, and the faint, ever-present smell of her own poverty. She imbues the silk with her exhaustion, her quiet desperation, her longing for a warm bed and a full meal. She is, in a very real sense, weaving her own spirit into the garment. She is creating a beautiful, haunted object. Because what is a ghost, really? But a memory that lingers, a residue of emotion impressed upon a place or a thing. These dresses were saturated with memory long before they ever reached the ballroom. They carried the memory of the cramped room where they were made, the silent curses of the seamstress, the collective misery of a system that valued the appearance of a lady more than the life of the woman who made that appearance possible. This was the great unspoken contradiction of Victorian fashion. The era that perfected the language of moral propriety, of the sanctity of the home, and the delicate nature of womanhood, was also the era that systematically devoured its own young women in the name of elegance. The very same society that fainted at the mention of a scandal was perfectly comfortable wearing the product of another woman's quiet ruin. The life of a slop worker like our Eleanor was a study in bleak arithmetic. She was typically paid by the piece, not by the hour. A complex dress like a ball gown might earn her a few shillings, from which she had to deduct the cost of her own thread, needles, and candles. To make enough to pay for a rented room and a meager diet of bread and tea, she had to work and work and work. 14, 16, 18 hours a day were not uncommon. She worked until her eyes failed, until her spine curved, until her lungs were weakened by the constant inhalation of dust and fibers. The social reformer Henry Mayhew, in his monumental work, London Labor and the London Poor, interviewed these women. And their voices come to us like whispers from the past, faint but clear in their despair. One young woman told him, "I am making trousers now. I get 7 pence a pair. I can do 3 pairs a day if I work from 6 in the morning till 11 at night." Another, a ball gown maker, said, "I have sometimes sat up for 3 nights together. I have no regular time for meals. I just have what I can get and a cup of tea, and then to work again." They were not slaves, not in the legal sense. They were free English women. But their freedom was the freedom to choose which form of slow death they preferred: starvation in the streets or consumption in an attic. The poet Thomas Hood, in his famous poem, The Song of the Shirt, published in 1843, captured this grim reality with a somber, rhythmic cadence that itself feels like the repetitive motion of a needle. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. The poem was a sensation. It was reprinted in newspapers and pamphlets. It was recited in drawing rooms. For a moment, the plight of the seamstress was the talk of the town. The public was moved. They were horrified. They shed a tear for the poor, fictional woman in the poem. And then, for the most part, they went back to buying their dresses from the same establishments that employed her. Because the system was convenient. Because the dresses were beautiful. Because it was easier to feel a pang of sympathy than actually change anything. So the work continued. The orders kept coming. And Eleanor in her attic kept sewing. She would finish Lady Arabella's gown, wrapping it in cheap paper, her hands trembling with fatigue and perhaps a little with regret, as if sending a child she'd nursed into a world of certain disappointment. She would receive her few coins, and then the next order would arrive. Another dress, another ghost to be created. And what of Lady Arabella? What happened when she put on the dress? She, of course, knew nothing of the attic, or the tired eyes, or the hollow hunger. She saw only the beautiful object. She felt the smooth silk, admired the intricate stitching, preened in the mirror as her maid tightened the corset laces. She was the picture of Victorian elegance. But perhaps, as she stood in the glittering ballroom, surrounded by admirers, she felt a sudden inexplicable chill. Perhaps a wave of profound sadness would pass over her for no reason at all. Perhaps she would feel a strange, fleeting connection to a world of suffering she could never truly comprehend. The dress, you see, carried its history with it. It was a vessel. It was haunted not by a specter in a white sheet, but something far more real. The ghost of a life spent in its creation. It was a beautiful, melancholy, and deeply unfortunate object. And Lady Arabella, for all her wealth and status, was merely its temporary wearer. Its true owner was the woman in the attic, whose spirit was stitched into every seam. So let's just drift for a moment on that thought. The idea that the grandest displays of wealth are often just the other side of a coin of profound suffering. That for every glittering ballroom, there is a dark attic. For every rustle of a silk skirt, there is the soft, tired sigh of the woman who made it. And perhaps, if you listen very closely to the quiet of the night, you can still hear the whisper of the needle, weaving its stories into the fabric of history itself. A gentle, rhythmic sound, pulling us deeper into sleep.
Let's just drift over now from that single attic, from Eleanor and her single dress, and widen our view just a little. Not too much, just enough to see the scale of it all. Because Eleanor was not alone, of course. She was one thread in a vast, tangled tapestry of Victorian industry. And like any industry, this one had its own hierarchy, its own arcane rules, and its own very specific forms of misery, distributed according to a rather precise and quietly brutal social calculus. So imagine, if you will, not one attic, but thousands, a city of attics, a honeycomb of suffering, stacked high above the bustling streets of London. In Soho, in Spitalfields, in Seven Dials, the lights in these upper windows would burn long after the fashionable shops below had closed their doors. From the street, if you bothered to look up, you might see the faint, flickering glow of a candle, moving like a weary firefly behind the glass. That was the sign of the slop-worker at her trade. And just as the dresses they made were not all the same, the women who made them were not a monolith. There was a taxonomy of suffering, you might say. At the very bottom were the plain workers, like our Eleanor, taking in whatever piecework they could find from middlemen known as sweaters. They were the ones making rough trousers, shirts, and basic gowns for the working poor. The pay was a pittance, the work was relentless, and the conditions were the worst. Then a small step up were the dressmakers and milliners employed by the more established shops. Their world was slightly more refined, but the pressure was, in its own way, even more intense. These were the artists creating the high fashion pieces for the ladies of quality. Their workrooms were often just as cramped, just as airless, but the standards were excruciatingly high. A single misplaced stitch, a hem that was a fraction of an inch off, could mean a deduction from their wages or instant dismissal. And the hours, especially during the season, were simply monstrous. We have accounts from the time, quiet, weary testimonies that speak of young girls, and they were often very young, 14, 15 years old, working from 6 o'clock in the morning until 2 or 3 the following morning, day after day. They would sleep in shifts on the floor of the workroom, their heads resting on bundles of cloth for a few precious hours before being shaken awake to resume their labor. They existed on a diet of strong tea and bread, because taking time for a proper meal was, of course, an unaffordable luxury. It was a life that systematically broke the body. The constant sitting led to spinal deformities. The poor light ruined their eyesight, often permanently. The inhalation of fine fibers from the materials, combined with the damp, cold conditions, led to rampant tuberculosis, which they called consumption, a word that perfectly described how the body was slowly, inexorably consumed by the work. There was a certain grim irony in the fact that these women, who created the very symbol of robust health and fertility, the wide-hipped, full-bosomed silhouette of the Victorian ideal, were themselves often pale, thin, and coughing blood into their handkerchiefs. But the psychological toll was perhaps even more profound. They lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade fear of the forewoman, who was often a harsh taskmaster, herself a product of the same brutal system. Fear of the shop owner, whose whims were law, and most of all, fear of the customer. The Lady Arabellas of the world were Now, let's turn our attention away from the attics for a moment and follow the finished dress. Let's imagine its journey from Eleanor's work table, wrapped in its cheap paper, carried down the narrow stairs, and delivered to the grand shop on Regent Street. It is brushed, steamed, and presented to Lady Arabella Harcourt for her final fitting. She stands before a tall, gilded mirror, a different creature entirely from the hunched, tired girl who made it. She is the consumer, the end point of all that labor, and she too is trapped in her own way. Because while the seamstress was haunted by the fear of starvation, the lady was haunted by the fear of social ruin. Her world, for all its apparent glitter, was just as rigid, just as unforgiving. The dress she was about to wear was not merely an outfit, it was a uniform. It was a piece of social armor, and if worn incorrectly, it could be just as lethal as any blade. The Victorian lady's life was a performance of almost exhausting perfection. Her dress had to be immaculate, but not too new-looking, which would suggest ostentatiousness. It had to be fashionable, but not too daring, which would suggest a questionable character. The fabric, the trim, the cut, the color, every element was a coded message to the world, and misreading the code could mean exclusion, whispers, a slow descent from the inner circles of society. A single dress could make or break a reputation. So when Lady Arabella scrutinized her reflection, she wasn't just admiring the fit. She was reading her own social obituary, or perhaps her manifesto. She would have been laced into a corset so tight it could rearrange her internal organs, because of course it could. She would be burdened with layers of petticoats, a crinoline cage that turned her into a walking piece of architecture. A human bell that required her to navigate doorways with the careful precision of a ship's captain in a narrow channel. Her every movement was restricted, prescribed. She could not run, she could not bend over easily, she certainly could not relax. The dress was, in its own way, a beautiful prison. And here lies one of the great quiet ironies of the situation. The wealthy Victorian woman, for all her power and privilege, was often just as powerless as the seamstress who served her. She was a commodity in the marriage market, a symbol of her husband's success, a decorative object whose primary function was to display his wealth. Her life was a constant, quiet performance of being pleasing, agreeable, fashionable but not faddish, religious but not fanatical, intelligent but not intellectual. It was a tightrope walk over a chasm of social disgrace. So when she wore Eleanor's dress to the ball, she was performing. She was smiling, she was dancing, she was making polite conversation, all while managing the immense physical discomfort of her costume and the even greater psychological weight of societal expectation. She was haunted too.
And so the ball must eventually end. The music fades, the guests depart, and the grand townhouses of Mayfair settle into a hushed silence. Lady Arabella, weary from the performance of the evening, is helped out of the magnificent gown by her lady's maid. The dress, its duty done for the night, is carefully brushed, perhaps spot-cleaned, and then hung in a vast dark wardrobe. It sits there, suspended in the darkness, surrounded by other beautiful, silent garments. Each one a story, each one a collection of memories, and, if we follow our thread, each one a vessel for other, quieter stories from the attics of the city. But what of the dress itself? This object that has been the center of so much attention, so much labor, so much unspoken emotion. Its journey is not quite over. Because fashion, in the Victorian era, was a relentless machine. A dress worn to a major ball could rarely be worn again to an event of similar importance without inviting comment. It would be noted. It would be seen as a sign of financial strain or, almost as bad, a lack of imagination. So the dress would be retired, or altered almost beyond recognition. Its fine silk might be re-dyed a darker color. The expensive trimmings would be carefully removed and saved for another project.
The skirt might be cut down into a visiting dress, the bodice refashioned into a jacket. It was a process of cannibalization, of taking a single grand creation and breaking it down into smaller, more practical parts. The dress, as a singular entity, would cease to exist. And what of Eleanor? Her journey, too, continues in its own cyclical, wearying pattern. The few shillings she earned for Lady Arabella's gown are quickly spent on rent and a meager supply of food and candles. And then another order arrives, another bundle of fabric, another intricate pattern, another ghost to be born. There is no grand finale for her, no dramatic end. There is only the next stitch, and the next, and the next. They're still with us. They are in the forgotten corners of every industry that relies on invisible labor. They are in the quiet spaces between the things we buy and the lives of the people who make them. The methods have changed, the geography has shifted, but the essential echo remains. The whisper of a question. Who made this, and what of their spirit remains within it? It's a soft, lingering thought, not meant to disturb, but to gently settle. A reminder that history is not just the story of the people who owned things, but also the story of the people who made things. As our time with this subject gently winds down, let's pull back one last time, not to a specific attic or a specific ballroom, but to a broader, softer focus. Let's consider the legacy of all this, the quiet, almost imperceptible residue that such a system leaves on the world, long after the last stitch was sewn and the last gaslight was extinguished. We might think that with the passing of the Victorian age, with the advent of new technologies and social reforms, this particular story reached its conclusion. The sewing machine did, of course, eventually become more common, but it didn't initially save the seamstress. It often just made her work faster, allowing her to produce more for the same meager pay. The real change was slower, more gradual, a shift in the atmosphere rather than a single event. But the ghost of this system, the spectral blueprint of this entire arrangement, never truly vanished. It simply learned to wear new fashions. The relentless pressure for ever-changing trends at the lowest possible cost migrated from the attics of London to the factories of the world. The same essential dynamic, the disconnection between the consumer and the human cost of production, persists on a global scale now. We might order a dress online, a dress that costs less than a meal in a restaurant, and give little thought to the distant hands that assembled it. We wear the modern equivalent of Eleanor's haunted dresses every day. We just call them by different names. And what of the psychological hauntings, the echoes of those dual anxieties? The lady's fear of social judgment has morphed, quite comfortably, into our modern obsession with personal branding and social media presentation. We still perform. We still curate our appearance with an eye toward public perception, terrified of a misstep that could lead to a different kind of social ruin. The pressure to be flawless, though the definition of flawlessness has changed, is as palpable as ever. The seamstress's fear of economic ruin is, for millions, just as real. It is the gig economy worker hoping for the next task to appear on their screen. It is the precarious nature of modern employment for so many. The tools have changed, but the underlying melody of uncertainty. There is a certain comfort, perhaps, in believing a story has a firm ending, a clear line where the narrative stops and silence begins. But history is rarely so obliging. Its stories tend to fray at the edges, their threads trailing off into the present, whispering of consequences we are still living with. So let us spend these final, quiet moments not on a conclusion, but on a kind of postscript, a lingering look at the echoes. Consider the physical object itself, the dress, after its useful life was over. When it could no longer be redyed, retrimmed, or refashioned, it faced its final dissolution. A gown of fine silk might be sold to a rag picker, its precious fibers pulped for the paper-making industry. It's a strangely fitting end, isn't it? The garment that carried so many silent stories might literally be transformed into a page upon which other, more official stories were written. The ghost of the seamstress's labor supporting the printed word of poets and politicians who would never know her name. Or perhaps the dress was simply discarded, left to molder in a trunk in a damp attic until it was discovered decades later by a different generation. A museum conservator now handles it with white gloves, her touch as gentle as Eleanor's was weary. She notes the fine stitching, the hidden repairs, the tiny, almost invisible flaws that speak of its humanity. She prepares it for display, pinning it onto a neutral mannequin under a soft, protective light. It is now an artifact. Its haunting has been sanitized, institutionalized, made safe for public consumption. The visceral memory of the ache in its creation is replaced by a label detailing its date, its fabric, and the name of its wealthy first owner. The cycle of erasure is, in a way, completed. And what of the language we inherited from this world? We still use the phrase, "a stitch in time saves nine," a quaint, pragmatic proverb that would have been a desperate mantra for a slop-worker racing a... Sometimes, the most haunting thing of all is not a sound, but a silence. The silence that follows the end of a story. The silence in the attic after the last candle is snuffed out. The silence of a name that was never written down. So let us, for this final part, simply sit with that silence for a while. Let us not try to fill it with more facts or figures, but simply listen to what it has to say. If you listen closely to the silence surrounding the Victorian seamstress, you begin to hear not an absence, but a presence. The presence of a question that can never be fully answered. We can know the statistics, the wages, the hours, the mortality rates. We can read the horrified reports of social reformers and the sentimental verses of poets. But we can never truly know what it was like to be Eleanor, sitting in that room, her world reduced to the circle of flickering light on a piece of silk. We can never know the specific texture of her despair, or the small private hopes that might have flickered in her heart despite everything. This is the ultimate ghost, the ghost of lost subjectivity. The millions of inner lives rich with their own unique thoughts and feelings that have vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only the barest outline of their existence. The dresses they made are the closest we can get to touching them. The tiny, perfect stitches are their fingerprints. The slight wear in the fabric at the cuffs is the ghost of their touch. It's a melancholy thought, but also a strangely unifying one. For this is a fate that awaits almost all of us. Our own inner worlds, our private struggles and quiet joys will likely fade into the same kind of silence.
And so we find ourselves here, at the true end of the spool. The last of the thread has been wound. The needle has been placed back in its cushion. Any further words would be redundant, like adding one more stitch to a finished garment. It would not strengthen the fabric, but only pucker it. So let this not be a continuation, but a decrescendo, a gentle winding down of the melody we have been following all this time. Let us replace analysis with atmosphere. Let us trade facts for feeling. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and imagine not the story, but the residue of it. Imagine the quiet of a museum long after the last visitor has left. The security lights are dim, casting soft, long shadows. And there, in the center of a room, stands a mannequin, wearing a gown of deep burgundy silk. It is perfectly still. The air around it is perfectly still. All the sound, the whispers of the seamstress, the chatter of the ballroom, the critiques of the shop foreman has been absorbed by the passage of time. All that remains is the object itself, a beautiful, silent vessel. This is the peace that comes after the storm. This is the silence that follows the story. It is not an empty silence, but a full one. It is heavy with all that has been, all that was endured, all that was forgotten. It is a respectful silence, the kind you find in a library or an empty church. The struggles we have spoken of, the economic brutality, the social suffocation, they were real. They were the storm, but they have passed. The attic rooms have been cleared or converted into expensive flats. The grand ballrooms are now hotels or corporate offices. The participants, from the lowest...
Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question all along. We have been searching for who wore the dresses, who haunted them, who carried their stories. But maybe the dresses themselves were never the true protagonists. Maybe they were merely the setting, the stage upon which a much quieter, more universal human drama was performed. Think of it not as a story about cloth, but about contact, the brief, invisible point of contact between two lives that would otherwise never have touched. Eleanor's world and Arabella's world were, for all practical purposes, different planets. They operated under different physical laws of society and expectation. They breathed different air, and yet, for a few weeks, their orbits aligned through the medium of a single garment. Eleanor's hands, chopped and cold, touched every inch of the silk that would later brush against Arabella's powdered skin. The same fabric that knew the chill of a garret later felt the heat of a crowded ballroom. It is a kind of intimacy, isn't it? An unacknowledged, deeply unequal, but profound intimacy. A transfer of essence, not through magic, but through the simple physical reality of creation and use. We sometimes forget how physically connected people were in the age before mass production. An object like a dress was not anonymous. It held the literal fingerprints of its maker. It carried the scent of their environment. It was a direct, tangible link in a chain of human experience. The haunting, then, is not supernatural. It is hypernatural. It is the simple, lingering truth of that connection, a truth that becomes more poignant with the realization that neither party was truly aware of it. Arabella never knew Eleanor's name. Eleanor likely only knew Arabella's as a label on an order form. They were ghosts to each other, phantoms in each other's realities. One was a phantom of labor, the other a phantom of privilege. And the dress was the liminal space where these two phantoms briefly met. This is a quieter, softer kind of tragedy. It's not about the dramatic injustice, though that was certainly...
And so we arrive here, at the final resting place of our story, the place where the last thread is woven in, where the final knot is tied, not with a pull of tension, but with a gentle, releasing sigh. We have wandered through attics and ballrooms, followed the lives of Eleanor and Arabella, and sat with the silence they left behind. There is truly nothing more to be said that hasn't already been murmured in the previous 9 parts. So let this be less of a continuation and more of a quiet closing of the cover, a soft extinguishing of the candle that has been illuminating this particular corner of the past. Think of the story now not as a narrative to be analyzed, but as a finished piece of embroidery. You have seen the front, the beautiful, intricate picture of the dress itself, with all its apparent elegance and social meaning. And you have seen the back, the tangled, knotted, less orderly side, where the countless beginnings and endings of threads are visible, the side that was never meant to be seen, but which holds the entire work together. The story of the Victorian seamstress is the story of the back of the embroidery. It is the hidden foundation without which the beautiful front could not exist. And now the work is done. The needle is still. The fingers that held it have long since turned to dust. The wearer of the dress, too, is gone. All the anxieties, the fears, the hopes, and the despairs, they have all been resolved by the most definitive and peaceful resolution of all, the passage of time. What remains is not the pain, but the pattern of how beauty.
There is a space beyond the end of a story, a quiet room where the echoes go to rest. We have stepped into that room now. The door has closed behind us. The tale of the seamstress and the lady, the dress and its ghosts, has been fully told. Any further words would not be part of the story, but merely a reflection in the dark window of its conclusion. So let these not be words about the story, but words about the silence that follows. It is a generous silence, a soft silence. It asks nothing of you. It does not require you to remember the details or to draw a profound lesson. It simply invites you to rest, to let the weight of all that history, the struggles, the injustices, the fleeting beauties, settle into the past where it belongs, and in doing so, become lighter. Imagine all those threads we have been following, the silk, the cotton, the lives of Eleanor and Arabella, now loosening their tension. They are not snapping, but gently unraveling, becoming soft and nebulous. They are losing their defined shapes and becoming mere sensation. The ache in the shoulders becomes a gentle weight. The pricked finger becomes a distant tingle. The rustle of silk becomes a soft whisper against the ear.
There is a point in every long story where the energy begins to change. The frantic pace slows. The sharp edges of immediate crisis begin to soften, worn down by the relentless, grinding passage of time. We have reached that point in our tale. The initial outrage, the shocking revelations, the poignant contrasts between attic and ballroom, they have all been established. They have been felt. Now we enter the phase of aftermath, the time of quiet consequences and slow, inevitable decline. Think of a candle that is burned for many hours. The flame is no longer tall and vigorous. It is smaller now, a steady, low ember that casts softer, deeper shadows. It still has light to give, but it is a different quality of light, a more contemplative glow. This is the light we sit in now, as we watch the final acts of this particular human drama. For Eleanor, and for thousands like her, the dramatic moments of rejection or temporary success were rare. The true substance of her life was the monotonous, soul-deadening routine, the slow, imperceptible accumulation of fatigue, the gradual dimming of her eyesight, so subtle she might not notice it from 1 month to the next, the deepening of the ache in her back, until it became a constant, familiar companion, a part of her very being.
This is not a story that builds to a grand theatrical climax. There is no single event that finally breaks her. There is only the slow, steady drip of hardship, each drop indistinguishable from the last, until the vessel of her spirit is simply full. It is an attrition of the soul, a quiet erosion. And what of the reformers, the preachers, the lawmakers? Their efforts, however well-intentioned, were like trying to bail out the ocean with a thimble. The factory acts might regulate the large, visible mills, but they could not reach into the thousands of individual attics, the countless private workrooms. The system was like a many-headed hydra. Cut off one head, a regulated factory, and two more would sprout in the form of unregulated slop work.
And so we find ourselves here, at the true end of the thread. The final knot has been tied, the last stitch pulled tight. There is a profound silence that descends when a long labor is complete. Not an empty silence, but a full, heavy one. The silence in the attic after Eleanor has laid down her needle for the last time. The silence in the ballroom after the last guest has departed and the final candle has been extinguished. We have followed this story through its many turns, from the first prick of the needle to the final weary sigh. We have seen the creation of beauty and the erosion of a life. We have witnessed the intricate, invisible connections between luxury and suffering. And now there is nothing left to witness. The process is complete. The story has told itself. What remains is not the pain, but the pattern it created. The pattern is the true legacy. It is etched into the historical record, not as a dramatic headline, but as a subtle, recurring motif in the tapestry of the industrial age. A motif of exploitation, of disconnection, of quiet desperation woven into the very fabric of progress.
There is a space that exists after the story, before the silence becomes absolute. It is the space we enter now, a space of pure aftermath. The final guest has left the ballroom. The last stitch has been placed in the garment. The last word of the poem has been recited. The energy that animated the narrative has dissipated, leaving only the hollowed-out forms it once occupied. Picture Eleanor's attic room, but not as it was when she worked there. See it now empty. A single, abandoned wooden chair pushed under a table. A forgotten thimble, a small circle of brass lying in a dust-filled sunbeam from the same grimy window. The air is still and cold. There are no ghosts here, not in the conventional sense. There is only absence. The absence of labor, the absence of breath, the absence of hope. This emptiness is more profound, more final than any specter could be. And the ballroom, too, stands empty. The great crystal chandelier, once a constellation of 100 flames, is now dark and still. The polished floor reflects nothing. A single lost glove rests on a velvet settee. The grandeur remains, but the life has fled from it. It is a beautiful corpse of a room. In this emptiness, the central metaphor of our story completes itself. The haunted dress hangs in a wardrobe in that silent ballroom, and the seamstress who made it is gone from her attic. The connection between them, once so vibrant with transferred emotion and unspoken suffering, has been severed by time. The transfer is complete. The object has outlasted its maker and its wearer. It remains, a beautiful, meaningless thing, its hauntings now so faint they are indistinguishable from the natural decay of the silk. This is the ultimate.
And so we arrive here, at the final resting place of our story, the place where the last thread is woven in, where the final knot is tied, not with a pull of tension, but with a gentle, releasing sigh. We have wandered through attics and ballrooms, followed the lives of Eleanor and Arabella, and sat with the silence they left behind. There is truly nothing more to be said that hasn't already been murmured in the previous 9 parts. So let this be less of a continuation and more of a quiet closing of the cover, a soft extinguishing of the candle that has been illuminating this particular corner of the past. Think of the story now not as a narrative to be analyzed, but as a finished piece of embroidery. You have seen the front, the beautiful, intricate picture of the dress itself, with all its apparent elegance and social meaning. And you have seen the back, the tangled, knotted, less orderly side, where the countless beginnings and endings of threads are visible, the side that was never meant to be seen, but which holds the entire work together. The story of the Victorian seamstress is the story of the back of the embroidery. It is the hidden foundation without which the beautiful front could not exist. And now the work is done. The needle is still. The fingers that held it have long since turned to dust. The wearer of the dress, too, is gone. All the anxieties, the fears, the hopes, and the despairs, they have all been resolved by the most definitive and peaceful resolution of all, the passage of time. What remains is not the pain, but the pattern of how beauty often... There is a place beyond the story, beyond the echo, even beyond the silence. We have reached it now. This is not another chapter, for all chapters are closed. This is the gentle closing of the book itself. The soft sound of a cover being shut, the faint displacement of air, the finality of a story returned to the shelf. If you were to hold the vellum page of this tale in your hands, you would see the illustrations we have painted with words. The attic, the ballroom, the needle, the gown. But the ink has now dried completely. The shell gold highlights no longer catch the light. The images are fixed, eternal, and utterly still. They cannot be changed. They cannot be added to. They are complete. The question we began with, who really wore the haunted dresses, has now been absorbed by the parchment itself. The question and its countless possible answers have become one with the medium. They are no longer separate from the page. To look at the page is to understand that the question was always more important than any single answer could be. The asking was the point, the gentle, relentless inquiry into the shadows. And in this final stillness, a last, soft realization dawns. There is a finality that is not an end, but a return. A return to the quiet that existed before the first word was spoken. We have passed beyond the story, beyond the echoes, beyond the very memory of the tale itself. We are in the state of after. Imagine the book containing this story not on a shelf, but on a lectern in a silent, deserted library. The air is still. Moonlight filters through a high window, illuminating the closed cover. There is no one to open it. The vellum pages, with their intricate miniatures and fine brown ink, are at rest. The narrative is not forgotten. It is simply complete, its energy spent, its purpose fulfilled. It has rejoined the great, silent archive of all that has ever been.
The question of who wore the dresses has been absorbed into the quiet. It no longer requires an answer. An answer would only be another word, and we have surpassed words.
We have reached the point where the story ceases to be a story and becomes simply a part of you. The words have done their work, and now they are receding, like waves pulling back from a shore, leaving only smooth, dark sand. The specific images, the needle, the silk, the candle, the tear, are losing their edges, blending into a soft, indistinct impression, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The thread that connected us to the past has now dissolved. It was never meant to hold forever. It was a temporary bridge, and we have crossed it. We are on the other side now, the side of sleep, the side of dreams, the side where history is not a series of events to be analyzed, but a gentle hum in the background of the mind, a lullaby sung in a language we no longer need to understand. There is no more. There is a moment when the last candle in a vast dark room gutters and goes out, not with a sound, but with a soft final sigh of light. A wisp of smoke curls upward, a last fleeting signature in the air, and then there is only the perfect, unbroken dark. We have reached that moment. The story is that spent candle. The final ember of narrative has been extinguished. All the components of our tale have now returned to their elemental state. The silk is raw fiber. The gold thread is mere metal. The words are just vibrations that have faded from the air. The attic and the ballroom exist only as architectural ghosts in a city that has been rebuilt 100 times over. The very memory of Eleanor and Arabella has been returned to the great silent library of lost time. There is no more to say because the subject itself has vanished. We are not at the end of the story. We are in the time after the story, a time of profound and absolute quiet, a peace that is not simply an absence of noise, but a presence of completion. A cycle has finished. The energy that began with the first word has now been entire.
Now that our specific tale of Eleanor and her ghostly gown has been laid to rest in the quiet archives of the night, let us, for a little while longer, simply linger in the pattern it revealed. Let us drift away from the specific smog of Victorian London and see how this same pattern repeats itself like a familiar motif in other times, in other places. Because the story of the unseen maker is not a single thread. It is a weave that runs through the whole vast tapestry of human history. Let your mind wander back, far past the smoking chimneys of the 19th century to the cool stone silence of a medieval workshop. Here we find another set of anonymous hands, not sewing silk, but weaving wool. The great tapestries of the Middle Ages, those monumental works that lined the draughty walls of castles and cathedrals, telling stories of unicorns and heroic battles. We admire them now in museums for their artistry, their vibrant colors, their narrative scale. We attribute them to regions, to workshops, sometimes to a master weaver. But we almost never know the names of the countless journeymen and apprentices, the women and children who sat at the great looms for years, their lives measured up not in stitches, but in countless repetitive throws of the shuttle. Their world was one of physical strain and muted color. while the finished tapestry might show a brilliant crimson from rare Kerms dye or a vibrant blue from woad, the weavers themselves lived in a world of undyed wool, of simple, coarse bread, of light from a high, narrow window. They breathed in the constant dust of the fibers. Their backs ached from the posture of the loom. They worked from dawn until the light failed, their labor a silent, collective effort to create a single, magnificent object that would, upon completion, be rolled up and sent away to adorn the life of a noble who would never know their names. Is that so different from the attic in Spitalfields? The scale is grander, the time frame longer, but the fundamental disconnect is the same. The creator is invisible. The creation is everything. The tapestry, like the ball gown, is a vessel. It contains not just the story depicted in its images, the hunt, the courtly love, but the silent, embedded story of its own making. The story of tired eyes, of skilled hands following a cartoon they did not draw, of lives spent in the service of someone else's grandeur. And just as the Victorian gown was haunted by the exhaustion of the seamstress, one could imagine a sensitive soul in a medieval castle running a hand over the woven image of a saint and feeling a strange, cool sense of devotion that was not their own. Let us drift now, as if carried on that sigh from the medieval scriptorium, to another chapter in this quiet history of unseen hands. Let us travel to the porcelain workshops of 18th century Meissen or Sèvres. Here, in rooms filled with fine white dust, another kind of magic was being made. The creation of porcelain, that translucent, delicate, almost ethereal substance, was one of the great technological marvels of its age. It was called white gold, and to own it was a supreme sign of taste and wealth. And who made it? Not the courtiers who displayed it in glass-fronted cabinets. Not the aristocrats who sipped their chocolate from its delicate, hand-painted cups. The makers were artisans who breathed in the kaolin dust that scarred their lungs. They were painters, often young women with keen eyesight, who spent their days applying intricate patterns of pink roses or cobalt blue borders, their world reduced to the tiny, repetitive motions of a fine brush. Their backs ached from hunching over their work tables, their eyes strained in the dim light, just as Eleanor's did over her silk. There is a particular poignant contrast here. Porcelain is famed for its hardness, its durability, its resistance to the elements. It can survive for centuries, emerging from the wreckage of a sunken ship or the rubble of a palace fire, seemingly untouched by time. Yet the hands that formed it, the lungs that breathed its dust, were among the most fragile and vulnerable things in that society. The object was made to last forever. The maker was often used up and discarded with shocking speed. The very robustness of the porcelain seems to mock the fleeting, fragile nature of the lives that created it. A noblewoman hosting a tea party would lift her cup, admiring the sheen of the glaze, the perfection of the gilding. She would comment on the fineness of the china, the elegance of the pattern. She would never, for a moment, consider the cough of the potter who threw it on the wheel, or the trembling hand of the painter who, after a 12-hour day, might find her own fingers could no longer hold a brush steady. The object, in its perfect, silent beauty, gave no hint of the human cost of its perfection. This is the same haunting, merely dressed in a different costume. It is the ghost of skill, of patience, of health, sealed forever inside an object of flawless beauty. When that noblewoman took her tea, she was not just drinking a beverage. She was, in a way, consuming the silent, exhausted focus of the artisan. The porcelain cup was a medium, a conduit for a kind of transference that no one at the table would ever acknowledge. And we can push this thread further into even starker territory. Consider the silver mine